This time last year, we were just beginning to understand the impact of the earthquake and tsunami in Japan. It eventually caused 4 times as much damage as Hurricane Katrina. Well, Roland Kelts is the author of the book Japan America, and he spends a lot of time in Japan. He joins us now for another in the series of conversations we call Pacific Rim Diaries to talk about the year after the tsunami and earthquake. Hi, Roland.
Hello, Madeline.
All right, so the disaster really changed the lives of the people who survived the assault of the tsunami. Nearly, 20,000 are presumed dead. But you went to one town, Ishinomaki, with a filmmaker. And tell us about that.
Yeah, I went up there with Stu Levy, who was the founder of a company called Tokyo Pop, which was actually based in L.A. It was a company that ran for 14 years and was a leading importer of manga and anime from Japan, so Japanese popular culture. And Stu founded the company, but he also had to fold the company last year, in February, in fact, largely because of the collapse of Borders. Mm-hmm. And Borders owed him close to $1 million at the time.
So he was there in Japan. He happened to be there at the time of the tsunami.
Yeah. Exactly. In fact, he was here in Tokyo apologizing to a lot of his suppliers. He was going through a really rough period, a kind of career meltdown. He was here in Tokyo when the earthquake hit, and as soon as he was able to get someone to drive with him, he drove up to Ishinomaki. He actually drove up to Sendai first, which is the largest city in that region. And then he started volunteering, and the group, Japanese volunteer group he was working with, moved on to Ishinomaki, where things were far worse.
So then a year later, you went back with him to see what it was like? That's
right. We went up together. I was out of Japan when the earthquake and tsunami hit. And so I wanted to have someone with me who could describe what had happened. And Stu had actually made a film about the volunteer work, documentary film. And so he was able to describe for me what things looked like a year ago. And we both went up to sort of see how the recovery had been proceeding, because Stu was last there in August of last year. One of the first places we visited was a former elementary school called Minato Shogakko, which was also used later as a shelter for survivors.
And there were 1,500 people living here and hundreds of volunteers coming and going. And
is this a temple up behind it?
It's a cemetery. And this was, I shot some stuff here because there were cars wedged in between the graves.
Between the gravestones?
Yeah.
What a grim sight.
It was, and then the cherry blossoms were blooming at that time. I mean, it was really the juxtaposition of the cherry blossoms and the graveyard and the cars upside down, and it was just right behind the shelter. It was just all very, to me, it was very symbolic,
Well, right, because cherry blossoms are a classic symbol of mortality in Japan, the fleetingness of life.
Last night at the premiere, Anis and Ayaz from Pakistan, who were volunteers, so they lived here for 2 months, and they lived right here in this gym.
There are 2 Pakistani gentlemen featured in the film who came up here from southern parts of Japan to volunteer and to actually prepare food for the victims. What are we hearing? Are these the school chimes? These are clearly automated school chimes, which are played in most Japanese schools to indicate that it's 5 p.m.
So, Roland, that must have been eerie for you to be standing in this empty schoolhouse hearing those chimes.
It was absolutely a haunting experience. I don't think I've ever before felt so strongly that spirits were hovering in the air. I was there alone after Stu had left, and it was absolutely terrifying at one point. I saw on the floor a pair of children's size slippers sitting neatly aligned, but for no reason whatsoever. The school had long been abandoned, and the shelter has long been abandoned. And the parts of the ceiling were caved in. You could see the mud and water lines on the ceiling of the first floor, and it seemed like something awful had just happened yesterday.
Well, what happened to those children who attended the school when the tsunami hit?
Those children, fortunately, were evacuated, and there were no casualties. The shelter was the school was deemed strong enough structurally to house victims.
What about the rest of the town, Ishinomaki? How is it faring now a year later?
Well, it's uneven because in parts of the town, it looks almost as if nothing has happened. There are shopping malls open. There are parking lots filled with new cars. On the other hand, when you venture further, you start seeing this bizarre sort of patchwork in which you have 2 or 3 buildings standing upright. Sometimes the roof will be bent or the front windows are broken. And then right around them are these patches of naked foundations, home foundations, where fortunately the debris has been taken away, but it almost looks like a pockmarked world.
And just reading your emails about this that you sent me, it's clear that you felt that something other than just mere rebuilding is going on. The fact that it's impossible to recreate what was there before.
Yeah, I interviewed a number of the residents and spoke to people in casual settings, and the most common response was that they had learned to appreciate every single day. And one young man, Yosuke, I interviewed, is a 25-year-old taiko drummer who has performed actually in New York City. And he told me that he wakes up and is grateful for every morning. And we were sitting at a restaurant, and he said, small things. And then he looked down at the table, and he said, like a glass of water. And it was a very telling moment. Of course, water was one of the resources that was in short supply in the immediate weeks and months after the quake. And just this notion that a tiny glass of water sitting on the table in front of him, and he just stared at it for a while. So I think what I discovered really was that it's not so much about recovery now as about adaptation to an entirely new world. And this idea of sustaining the good things that you have is a lot more important than dreaming of recovery. It's never going to go back to March 10, 2011. And these are very pragmatic people. They're Northerners. And I never heard a word of self-pity. It was just that it's time to appreciate what we have.
Roland Kelts, he's the author of Japan America. That's a book about how the Japanese have influenced American pop culture, and he divides his time between Japan and the United States. And we've been talking about the effects of the tsunami a year later in Japan. Roland, thank you.
Thank you, Madeline.